Good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, we have the pleasure and honor of Rahsaan Hall's company. Rahsaan Hall is the director of the Racial Justice Program for the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts. In this role, he helps develop the ACLU of Massachusetts integrated advocacy approach to address racial justice issues. Through legislative advocacy, litigation, and community engagement, the program works on issues that deeply impact communities of color and historically disadvantaged communities. Rahsaan also manages the ACLU of Massachusetts What a Difference a DA Makes campaign to educate state residents about the power and influence of district attorneys. Prior to joining the ACLU of Massachusetts, Rahsaan was the deputy director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice, where his work has included policy and legislative advocacy, community outreach, and maintaining a litigation caseload of voting rights, police misconduct, and public accommodation cases. Rahsaan headed up the Voting Rights Project that included the coordination of statewide election protection initiatives, voting rights litigation, and his prior involvement in community coalitions on redistricting after the last decennial census. He also served as an assistant district attorney for the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. A significant proportion of his work in the DA's office included his time in the Safe Neighborhood Initiative and senior trial units where he prosecuted drug, gang, and homicide cases. In addition to leading the ACLU of Massachusetts Racial Justice Program, he has also serves on the Hyams Foundation's Board of Trustees, and he's also a member of the Massachusetts IOLTA committee. Rahsaan, you're going to have to tell me what that is, as I'm still pretty new to the area. Rahsaan, who is admitted to practice in Massachusetts and the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts, is a graduate of the Ohio State University, Northeastern University School of Law, and Andover Newton Theological School. He's an ordained reverend in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. In 2018, I should say, Rahsaan was also named one of Boston's 100 most influential people of color. We are so grateful to have you here today. I'm hoping that I can call you Rahsaan. Maybe I should call you Reverend. What would you prefer? It's whatever you want. So the way we, as you all know, we either do have a conversation with our guest, or we allow our guest to do a presentation. Sometimes there's a combination, a hybrid approach. Rahsaan has chosen to have a conversation. So while he and I are having this conversation, as questions come up for you, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. And as soon as we open it up for Q&A, this is after I have my conversation, Chris Winship will offer his questions that Rahsaan will respond to, and then we will open it up for everyone to be a part of this conversation. So don't forget that. Also, remember to keep your questions relatively short so that we can have as many people ask questions as possible. Really looking forward to hearing what you all have to say today. So welcome, Rahsaan. How are you doing today?
I am well. Thank you again for the invitation, and it's fine to call me Rahsaan. Okay. And IOLTA is interest on lawyer trust accounts. So okay, when attorneys hold people's money, the interest on that goes to public service organizations.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for clarifying that. I have to admit to you, I'm feeling like I want to call you Rev, but I will work out of that.
I mean, if you want to call me Rev, you can call me Rev. Right. That's fine.
Okay, so well, let's begin by talking about What a Difference a DA Makes campaign, which I am fascinated about. So this campaign was an attempt to educate the public about the important role that DAs play in the criminal legal system, including playing a major role in helping to drive up rates of incarceration. The data also, so you did some research you did some surveys of folks to find out what it is they understood about the system. And what the data revealed was that people just knew very little about the role that prosecutors play, and seemed to think that they didn't have much of a role in creating some of the problems that we associate with the criminal legal system. And it sounds like then the campaign was about educating them. What I would love for you to do to start off this conversation is to share with our audience the impetus behind the campaign, how effective it's been in shaping voters' understanding about the DA's role and what role the campaign has played in moving the public toward embracing progressive prosecutors in Suffolk County, in this area,
Yeah, sure.
maybe the state.
Yeah, certainly. So as you read in my bio, I served as a prosecutor in Suffolk County, which is largely Boston, but also Chelsea, Winthrop, and Revere, for 8 years. And I prosecuted any number of cases. And what I saw overwhelmingly, that the people that I prosecuted were probably 90% Black or brown. And, Suffolk County is, somewhere a little north of 50% people of color, but to have that significant disparity. And I was in Dorchester District Court when I started out, but then I was in Superior Court. And so those experiences shaped my perspective as a civil rights attorney and advocate. But when I got to the ACLU, one of the things that we do in our advocacy is that we take what's called an integrated advocacy approach. And so where our work intersects through our litigation, our policy work or lobbying, and our grassroots or community organizing work. And one of the things that consistently came up was the role that district attorneys played. And so I knew from my own personal experience as a prosecutor, how much influence prosecutors have, or the district attorney has, on the criminal legal system. They are one of the most influential people or powerful people, if not the most powerful person in the system that barely anybody knows about. Through our litigation, folks may be familiar with the drug laboratory scandal in the Hinton lab with Annie Ducan and the Amherst lab with Sonia Farrick. The role that the district attorney's office played to block the resolution of those cases. They were fighting to maintain these tainted convictions. From a policy advocacy standpoint, we consistently advocated for sentencing reform, the repeal of mandatory minimums or bail, or raising the age. And it was the district attorneys who had an outsized amount of power and influence with the legislature that prevented some of those reforms from happening. And so we decided to launch this campaign. And as you mentioned, we did some polling to find out that, roughly 54% of the voters didn't think that district attorneys had that much power, that it really didn't matter who the DA was, and that only 4 in 10 voters in Massachusetts knew that the DA was elected. And so, didn't know that the DA was elected. And so that was a significant problem for us. But what we also learned through some focus groups is that when confronted with the information about district attorneys, what they do, what they have power over, 81% of voters said that they would pay attention to the next district attorney election. And so this was 2017. And so we launched the campaign in the end of 2017 and really began to engage the public on it. We started out with a goal of focusing on 2 to 3 district attorney races. We saw that District Attorney Dan Conley from Suffolk County decided not to run. That was shortly after we had announced our poll. And so there was immediately a field of challengers. And as we started the rollout of this campaign, we actually worked with the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute and held a forum where we invited experts from across the nation to talk about prosecutorial power and discretion and the impact that they have. There were several people who were at that convening. One person actually, because of that convening, ended up running to challenge the Middlesex district attorney in Cambridge, where you all sit, Donna Padalano. And so those were the 2 that we started out with, but then we heard that there was going to be a challenger in Worcester County. And then we heard that there was going to be a challenger out in Berkshire County. Again, someone else who was inspired to run based on the public information work that we had done. And then finally one here in Plymouth County, where I live in Brockton, who ran. So a total of 5 races. And out of those 5 contested races, 2 of them were won by progressive prosecutors, Rachel Rollins here in Suffolk County and Andrea Harrington out in Berkshire County, an attorney who had no prior criminal experience, but because of the platform that she embraced and the way that the public had been engaged on the narrative shift around prosecutorial power, won with a groundswell of support and there was a significant increase in voter participation. The increase in voter participation in Berkshire County was up by 126%. And that was the only major race on the ballot. So that says a lot. And so as far as what we did public education forums where we went out and spoke to people about what it is prosecutors do, what they have power over, the decisions that they can make, the discretion that they choose to use or not use, the influence that they have in the legislature. We paid formerly incarcerated people to go out and canvass because we felt they were the folks who had the best insight and perspective about the effect that the prosecutor can have on someone's life. And we weren't advocating for any candidates. We did this in a nonpartisan, non-electioneering way, but we were campaigning for the platform of shifting the priorities of prosecutors' offices. We held candidate forums, two of them that I'm probably the proudest of. The first one was in Roxbury in Dudley Square in the heart, or what is now Nubian Square, in the heart of the Black community of Boston at Hibernian Hall that was packed to capacity. But the other one that we had was in Suffolk County House of Correction, where the people who were asking the questions were the people who were incarcerated, because despite whether or not they were legally entitled to vote because they were detained on a felony, they are still residents of the county, and the district attorney is accountable to them, and not only them, but their family members. I think that was the first time in history that, certainly in Massachusetts, where there had been a race for a public safety office that had been held inside of a correctional facility. And so, since that time, we've continued to engage the district attorneys, whether it's on releasing people from custody because of the COVID cases, calling them to account on whether or not they have Brady lists. We've recently sent out public records requests to all of the district attorneys to see what their policies are on bail or pretrial detention or case processing, charging decisions, how they treat juveniles within their system. What do they do about the racial disparities within their system? Are they a transparent office? Do they make their policies publicly available? And so we'll evaluate them, and we're continuing to gear up for the next DA election in 2022, and we're focusing on 8 counties this time. I think you're muted.
Okay, there you go. So really very interesting stuff, an amazing campaign, and with pretty incredible results. You've noted in some of your public statements that there are a huge number of benefits that are associated with progressive prosecutors and their efforts to, one of the major efforts that they put forward is to decline to prosecute low-level offenses. That's a major move and one that should have some impact on our rates of incarceration. Can you share this perspective with us? What are the benefits to declining to prosecute these low-level offenses? I believe DA Rollins has identified about 15 different kinds of offenses that she refuses to prosecute moving forward, although there's some suggestion that maybe that is happening anyway. Can you share your perspective on the benefits associated with this move, and then the concerns that critics share, which seem to be along the lines of, hey, to what extent is this going to increase crime? This will increase crime. How do you respond to them? And why should we embrace this form of a kind of decriminalization anyway?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's another conversation that's happening as it relates to progressive prosecutors, and that's the conversation around abolition. Mm-hmm. And those, in some instances, those conversations are at odds because to the extent that people can profess to be or campaign as progressive prosecutors, that gives them some sort of public covering so that they can move their agenda forward and be held to a different level of accountability by left-leaning or progressive folks because they can say that they are progressive. And reforms, the reforms that we've seen in prosecutors' offices aren't always necessarily the reforms that are going to lead to the dismantling of this system of oppression. Abolitionists who have been fighting for the dismantling of police systems, prosecutors' offices, prisons, are fighting for a world that we believe in, where we can be safe without these same institutions that are racist and harmful. And so the challenge is, abolitionists have been operating in this space, progressives have been operating in this space, and the lines have not always been clearly articulated. There are certainly a group of folks who have been doing a lot of work in the abolitionist space to make those clear lines, to say, if you are abolitionist and you are organizing around this work to get progressive prosecutors, or if you are organizing in the space around prosecutor elections, here are some key elements that you need to be aware of. And it's really about not building out further systems and structure. Or one of the pieces of it that's significant in my mind is not building out further systems and structures that we'll have to tear down later, right? By DA's offices wanting to expand the social interaction and community engagement. If we're saying we don't need these institutions in our communities, well, let's not empower them to have more of a footprint in our communities. Let's dismantle that, and let's send the resources to the community-based organizations that are serving the people's needs that ultimately end up being criminalized. And so to your question about decriminalization of low-level offenses, what's maybe not shocking to some, it certainly wasn't to me, is that an overwhelming majority of cases are brought in the district court. In Massachusetts, criminal cases are either brought in the district court or superior court. And superior court are some of the more significant level felonies that we see people charged with. We did a study back in 2019 called Facts Over Fear that looked at the 15 charges that DA Rachel Rollins, or candidate Rollins, said she would not prosecute. What I knew as a former prosecutor is those 15 offenses: trespassing, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, motor vehicle offenses, simple possession. We dismiss those cases all the time. But opponents of that, law enforcement, conservatives, law and order folks, started with the fear mongering and saber rattling, saying that if you dismiss these types of cases, there will be bedlam and mayhem in the streets and the criminals will run wild. And it just wasn't true. And it's not true. We knew that it wasn't true because I knew that these were the cases that we dismissed all the time. And our study revealed that, over half of these cases ended up being dismissed. But what it also revealed, and to the point around the benefits of it, is that these low-level charges were disproportionately applied to Black and Latinx folks in Suffolk County. They were more likely to be charged with these offenses, and less likely or more likely to have an adverse outcome, meaning that there was some sort of finding, as opposed to it just being dismissed outright. So one of the benefits is that it does something to address some of the racial disparity in the cases that are brought against people. And the other benefit is that it unclogs a lot of the backlog in the cases. But again, this conversation around abolition, if there were a greater investment in the resources or the underlying needs that people have, the resources to address the underlying needs that people have, issues around poverty, issues around mental health, issues around substance use disorder, issues around trauma, that is a majority of what police get called to respond to. If we weren't spending our time and resources prosecuting those low-level cases for the remaining 50% or however many, 40-some-odd% that were still moving through the court, like, what was the point of having those cases prosecuted to begin with, when we could have taken the money and addressed the underlying needs that people have? I think it would really free up a lot of resources to get to get us closer to this abolitionist vision, and to the the naysayers or the fear mongers. The reality, I think the response is the same. Let's address people's issues and needs. instead of criminalizing them, because it creates this cycle. People's life trajectory is dramatically impacted from every court appearance that they have. And if they are held on bail for some of these low-level cases that ultimately end up being dismissed, that has a deleterious effect on people's lives. They can end up losing their jobs, they can end up losing their housing, and in some instances can end up losing custody of their children. And it's really disrespectful to have those cases linger, people be held on those cases, and then the case ends up getting dismissed. A great organization here, the Massachusetts Bail Fund, did a study, and it showed that like over 50% of the cases that they had posted bail on ended up being dismissed. And this is disrupting people's lives for what reason? And then I guess just finally with these low-level offenses, I looked at the 2019 stats for cases filed in Massachusetts, and it showed that nearly 20% of all of the cases filed in district court were motor vehicle offenses, operating on a suspended license, operating without a license, and uninsured, operating an uninsured vehicle. To me, that speaks volumes about the way policing happens, particularly in communities of color. And I know that that was a statewide report, but I also know from other studies and other issues that police use the motor vehicle stops as a way of engaging people. Pretextual stops, which are constitutional, are used to engage people, and they stop somebody and they see what's in the car. If someone appears nervous, that justifies them giving that person an exit order. Or if people don't know their rights, they start asking the passengers for their names and identifications, absent any quote unquote furtive gestures or any legitimate reason for officers to give exit orders for people. And then they begin to search the cars. And that's why in this last legislative session, there was a piece of legislation for a hands-free driving bill that would now criminalize just having a phone in your hand, which I understand because distracted driving has always been a problem, but we were fighting for data on who the police were stopping. And that's what kind of held the bill up, because we wanted data on all stops, not just the stops that resulted in citations, because we knew that giving police more tools gives them more power and more tools to abuse. And there was a recent study that just came out. The Northeastern researchers looked at it, and I think WCVB did a report where the first analysis of this data shows that white drivers were given warnings more often under this hands-free driving bill. So the fact that these tools that police have, particularly when it comes to these types of low-level offenses, are going to be executed in Black and brown communities in a disproportionate way. And so that's another benefit of decriminalizing or prosecutors' offices refusing to prosecute those types of low-level offenses.
Yeah. You mentioned cash bail a bit earlier, and that is another driver of racial disparities across the country and including in Mass. It's essentially being eliminated in a number of states, cities, and counties across the country with no discernible decreases in public safety. Why hasn't this happened in Massachusetts, a state that, describes itself always as very progressive, front of the line in terms of every kind of innovation? This seems like an obvious move. What's happening in Massachusetts so that this hasn't emerged? What barriers need to be overcome or removed so that the elimination of cash bail in parts of or all of Massachusetts becomes a reality?
Yeah, we've got an issue here in Massachusetts. I say this all the time, and so folks who have heard me speak before will probably familiar with this term. I say that we here in Massachusetts suffer from liberal exceptionalism. We think that because we're one of the first abolitionist states or the first state to allow same-sex marriage, or that we overwhelmingly vote for the Democratic nominee in presidential elections, that we don't have these issues around either race or the criminal legal system. And it's just not true. And so to the extent that we project ourselves as this liberal bastion of progressive ideas, that might be in Boston, that might be in Cambridge, that might, be in Brookline. But when you start getting outside of 128 in different parts of the state, the demographics really shift, and the, people's voting propensities also change. You know, I say there's a little island out west in kind of the Northampton, Amherst area as well. So, but that said, I think the approach, and this is something that has always frustrated me when it comes to criminal law matters, and it's probably consistent across the board, excuse me, with other legislative issues, is whenever there is an effort to bring about reform, to address past harms of the criminal legal system, lawmakers want empirical data to assuage any fears that they have about harm and threats to public safety. We need to know that this reform that is being proposed is going to work, because you've got police officers and district attorneys and other law enforcement officials saying, if you don't allow us to charge mandatory minimums, if you take away qualified immunity, if you don't charge people with these low-level offenses, you all will be in danger. We're saying this out of your best interest to keep you safe. So don't change these systems that we have in place. And so lawmakers are responsive to that. And they say, well, we kind of believe what the advocates are saying, but we want proof. We want data. We need empirical evidence to show that getting rid of mandatory minimums aren't going to change things, right? So that's one thing.
But with regards to bail, we have San Francisco, we have New Jersey, we have New York, we have Santa Clara County, we have Houston, Harris County. We have a lot of evidence. We're just floating in it at this point, swimming in it, that suggests that you can do this without harms at all to public safety, at least at some level.
Absolutely. And that's what advocates have been saying. But again, because of that exceptionalism here, well, we don't know that those examples fit Massachusetts. We've got different data here, which, by the way, our data is trash. And it's just not usable. And so, but, they want to know that the reforms that have worked other places can work with the data set, with the facts on the ground that we have, which it's a ridiculous argument, but that's kind of what we're up against. But also this idea that we're able to work it out for ourselves. So like the SJC, rest in peace, Chief Justice Ralph Gantz, who was a very strong leader on criminal law reform, to the extent that a jurist could be one. Under his leadership of the court, there was a case, Commonwealth v. Brannigan, that really brought into focus the issue of people being held on bail at bail amounts that they could not afford. And so it created an obligation for the court to inquire into a person's ability to pay, because requesting a bail that someone could not make raised serious constitutional concerns. And that decision was ultimately codified in the 2018 criminal law reform bill. And so Massachusetts, being full of itself, saying, well, let's see how this works. Because we don't want people held just because they're poor. So let's see how it works with the Brannigan decision and the codification of it. But the reality is it can work. We don't have a problem with people not showing up to court. There was a bail commission that was enacted with that law, and the data showed that an overwhelming majority of people come back to court, and so it's not a problem. What the problem becomes, and I think this is something for advocates to struggle with, is what are the alternatives? Because there is a desire on the part of many to be able to restrain or incapacitate people that they feel may be a threat. And so, there is a provision in the law that allows for prosecutors to have someone held pursuant to a dangerousness hearing, because they are either a danger to the community, and no condition of bail is going to keep the community safe. The problem is that prosecutors, and as a former prosecutor, I know this fear, is that you release somebody on bail and then they go out and do some horrific crime, and the press and the public turn that scrutiny onto you, like this person should have been held, when in reality there's no predictor of who is going to commit the next crime. And so that's the tension there. Out in Berkshire County, District Attorney Andrea Harrington said she was going to stop using cash bail, But what has happened is there has been a significant increase in the number of dangerousness hearings that her office has pursued. And the problem with dangerousness hearings is that the person is held without bail indefinitely until the case is resolved, which isn't fair either. And I think the other cautionary tale is like what we've seen in California, where the alternative to holding people with bail is electronic surveillance. And we put in electronic shackles on people. It's like, yeah, we're not going to hold you, but you don't have any freedom either.
You, right?
Exactly. We ain't going to hold you, but we're going to hold you.
I appreciate that very much. So you mentioned earlier traffic stops, and there's a 2014 ACLU report that came out in Massachusetts that Black residents were disproportionately targeted for FIOs, representing basically 2/3 of stops, frisks, searches, observations, and interrogations. So one of the things that I am frequently asked is what role does data play in shaping policy? And so you collect these data, you report on the findings. Since that report was released, has there been any progress made to your knowledge in terms of the disparities in FIOs? And if so, do you think the report played a part in that? Do you know?
So the short answer is I don't think it really made that much of a difference, but the report was important. That report, and here's why it's important, right? You know, the ACLU had been receiving complaints from people in communities, particularly communities of color, about police misconduct, the way that people were being racially profiled. And so we filed a public records request to get this FIO data, field interrogation, observation, stop and frisk reports that they keep, because we wanted to see. And there was a long, protracted, not battle, but exchange between the ACLU and the Boston Police Department to get that data. And finally, when we were preparing to file suit, they came up with a compromise, which was that they would take their 2007 through 2010 data and turn it over to a researcher to analyze and issue a disparity report. And so our organization was at the table for the updates with the researchers. And ultimately, it got to the point where the researchers had their final findings, but they hadn't finished their report. And so as the ACLU, we were sitting in possession of, we had in our possession this information that was relevant to the community concerns that were brought to us. And because we sensed the delay in their desire to release it, we had access to the preliminary findings or the findings. We said, we're going to release this report, and you can release it with us or you're not going to. And, and therein lies some of the tension that exists between Boston Police Department and the ACLU. We ultimately, when we gave an opportunity for them to meet with to release with us so that they could put their spin on it, but they didn't want to. So we released it, and it captured the headlines. And the value of that is that it led to the shifting of the conversation, right? Just like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow changed people's conversations about mass incarceration. And to the extent that there's been critique of the accuracy of her identified problem, that's irrelevant, right? The major impact of that book is it normalized the conversation about racism in the criminal legal system and how mass incarceration was a problem. And so that's what this report did for the Boston Police, even though there was ample evidence and history of racial profiling and racist policing in the city of Boston, going back even before the Charles Stewart case. But, after that report, there was a level of scrutiny under the police department. And so they started putting their data online and publishing it. But all of a sudden, like in 2016, they just stopped. And so, we kind of asked them where it was, and the Boston Globe started pursuing it. And the Globe finally got some of the data from them. And it showed that instead of making up 63% of the stops, Black people by that time were then making up, I think, like 65% of the stops. So it went up. But what did change was when we did our report, 75% of the cases were for investigate person, just this arbitrary, undefined, non-specific reasoning. By the, whatever it was, 2016, 2018, when we got the updated information, investigate person was down to like 17%. And so there were like reasons now why we're racially profiling y'all. Right. But I think the other benefit is a case called Commonwealth v. Warren, where there was a Black man who was walking in Roxbury. The police had responded to a call of a burglary, got a general description and a general direction of flight, and searched the area for a while, and then saw a gentleman in the park and didn't match the description of the suspects beyond being Black and having a hoodie and being in Roxbury. And so the police said, "Hey, you stop," and he took off running through the park. And in that case, the appeals court looked at the ACLU report to bring forward this issue around racial profiling and why a person would run from the police. And then ultimately, when it went up to the Supreme Judicial Court, Justice Geraldine Hines, a Black woman who lived in Roxbury, who was a former public defender, said, the value of this report shows this history of racial profiling, and that a person might just as much be running from the police because of consciousness of guilt as they would be to avoid the persistent indignity of being racially profiled. So it did help.
Yeah, absolutely. So one final question for me before I turn it over to my partner in crime, if you will, Chris, is so we've been talking about policing. We've seen major reform happen, not just in Boston, but in Massachusetts, generally speaking, and in many parts of the country. The types of reforms that will be enacted in the city and the state are different, but for each, greater racial equity and far less police brutality in treatment are primary objectives. Since George Floyd's murder in late May of last year, you have made a number of public statements about the types of reforms needed in Boston and in the Commonwealth. How would you assess the kinds of reforms that have been put forward by the city and the state? Again, strengths, weaknesses, you take it from here.
Yeah, I appreciate the responsiveness of, municipal leaders and state lawmakers. I think in Boston, convening a task force was a great step forward, and the recommendations of that task force were adopted to create an Office of Police Accountability and Transparency, to put further limits on police use of force, to require the use of body-worn cameras throughout the department, and to have that strong policy. I think those are going to be, that system that's being instituted is going to be helpful. But again, it's also in tension with these abolitionist principles of putting more resources towards policing. And if we really believe that we can live in a community without armed men patrolling our street, and I say men because it's overwhelmingly men, and because of the toxic masculinity that exists within these departments, that's part of the problem of the culture of policing. To the extent that that's a vision of a world that we can have, the more that we're putting money into building out these systems of accountability, the less that is able to go, or the less that folks are willing to spend on the underlying needs, because they now have a renewed sense of faith in this reformed department. Similarly, with the state law, we did a lot of advocacy to bring about some meaningful changes, and some of the things that we advocated for were included, but others were not. The cornerstone of this bill was the creation of a post system, or a peace officer standards and training system. Massachusetts was only one of 4 states that did not have a post system. That said, a post system is only as good as the teeth that it has. Minnesota had a post system, but you saw Officer Derek Chauvin choke the life out of George Floyd while his officer colleagues stand around and watch. And here's an officer with 18 prior complaints of misconduct. What good is that post system? Or in Ohio, that has a post system, and the officer who killed Trayvon Martin had just been released from another police department, the very thing that a post system is supposed to prevent. Having said all that, what I see in the post bill that we have here in Massachusetts makes it arguably one of the strongest, if not the strongest, post system in the country, because it is made up of a majority civilian board, because it has its own independent investigatory and subpoena power. Municipalities or appointing agencies are required to share misconduct information with them. There is a list of 16 mandatory decertifiable offenses. And I think those are all very significant aspects of this post system that will bring about a greater level of transparency and accountability within law enforcement. But again, the tension is, to the extent that we have now certified these officers and given them the seal of approval of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, there is a greater reliance to say, well, they're certified now, so we shouldn't have these problems. While meanwhile, there are folks out there that are saying, like, tear all this stuff down. We don't need this to be safe in our communities. We really pushed for a limit on qualified immunity, which is the legal doctrine that protects police officers from civil liability when they violate people's rights. And there was decent language in the Senate version of the bill, terrible language in the House version of the bill. When those two bills went into the conference committee to resolve those differences, what came out was the House version language, which was terrible. So there's really no reform to qualified immunity. And when you think about the architecture of policing, the legal precedent, as my colleague Matt Siegel, our legal director, likes to talk about, that authorizes police conduct, it comes from the courts. And part of the reasons police officers engage in the misconduct and are never held accountable or less willing to be restrained by it is because that they know that the law will protect them for violating people's rights. We also fought for limits on face surveillance technology, which is an unreliable and racist technology that misidentifies people of color, particularly dark-skinned Black women, at a rate of like 40%. And to just be able to have law enforcement use that whenever and however they want with no regulations is unconscionable. And so we fought to regulate that. Got some minor regulations. We're still continuing to fight. There are some other positive things. There's schools now have the ability to remove cops from their schools, or what we call school resource officers. There are prohibitions on law enforcement sharing information about children with intelligence gathering agencies like the Regional Intelligence Center or gang databases. There's more opportunity for young people to expunge entries on their juvenile record. So those are good things that we like to see. There were a bunch of commissions that were created to study some of these issues, which is a mixed blessing. On one hand, it's kicking the can down the road, but on the other hand, it creates research and recommendations that can be used for much more meaningful law enforcement. I think another key piece that's actually substantive are some of the use of force standards. There's a ban on chokeholds, limits on the use of no-knock warrants and tear gas and rubber bullets and other kinetic impact weapons and chemical crowd control agents, and a duty to intervene was created. So those are some of the important pieces that are there, but it's not defunding or divesting from police. It's not greater investment in community. The post system, I think, is the floor for accountability at the state level, but municipalities can go even further. And so my fear is that as local advocates try to get their police department to change some of their policies, or to have greater transparency, or to create civilian review board with teeth, the local municipality is going to say, well, we got the post system, so we don't have to do that. But again, it's the floor, it's not the ceiling.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm going to pass it along to Chris.
Well, thank you very much for all your thoughts, Rahsaan. Clearly, there's an enormous amount of work still to be done. So we're going to have a new mayor, who knows who. Maybe we have a new commissioner, maybe we're still going to get a new commissioner. Who knows what? In terms of actual concrete steps, what do you see as being on the ACLU's agenda, your agenda? I mean, sure, we'd like to. I think there's actually quite broad agreement that we need a lot more investment in social services and helping people deal with their challenges in their lives. But what would you be recommending specifically to the mayor or to the commissioner, or going back to the governor, though he may be exhausted with past effort.
Yeah, they say in the legislature, like once you pursue legislation and it loses, you've lost for 10 years. But that's not going to stop us. I think at the city level, for the city of Boston, we'll continue to advocate for a drawing down of the resources that are spent on policing. Mayor Walsh reduced the BPD overtime budget, but it was nominal. It wasn't what the community advocates were asking for. Greater transparency around the gang database. The fact that this database exists and there's no audit of it. We have no idea of the breadth of information that is contained in there and the impact that that has on people's lives, whether individuals get reported. There was a young man who was deported because ICE found out through the gang database that a Boston police officer or school resource officer said that this young man was a part of a gang. And so the lack of transparency around that gang database, like it should be abolished. It should be eliminated altogether. And here's the thing, it's always put up against the concerns of public safety, but how many terrorist attacks have been thwarted because of the gang database? And I think that goes to the larger conversation around this notion of public safety. Rarely, if ever, do police prevent crimes. An overwhelming majority of the things that they do is responding to complaints of crime. And there are greater problems and racial disparities when they are initiating the work. And so I think we just, so we're going to really continue to push on the pressure points that highlight the need to invest resources in other places. And so when you look at that overtime budget, there's people who are making $300,000 a year. That's more than the mayor makes. And there's several officers that are making those types of salary that could be going towards so many other things. And the response that they have to particular incidents, when you look at the homicide solve rate in the Black community, like we're not getting our money's worth for the type of investment that we're making in policing. So a shifting or a diverting of resources. We fortunately were successful in securing a ban on the use of face surveillance technology in Boston, which has helped kind of leverage the conversation at the state level. But that's one of the things that we have to go back to the state level for, to get that outright ban on police officers being able to just go purchase any off-the-shelf facial surveillance software and use it at their own discretion without any regulations on it. I think another significant issue is around racial profiling. The fact that despite our protestations about how the hands-free driving bill would lead to more people of color being stopped, the bill moved forward without the additional consideration of collecting data for all stops. It's one thing to say, here are all the people who were stopped and were issued citations, but it's another thing to get to the heart of what racial profiling is about, is to get the data on all of the stops where there weren't citations issued, because how are we ever going to pinpoint the problem officer or the problem department if we don't have that information? So, those are a couple of the things that we're really going to try to focus on. Clearly, more resources for people who are struggling with substance use disorder. We saw Boston Police Department and the city of Boston's response to what's called methadone mile, a very aggressive and forceful approach to clearing out an entire segment of the city, which admittedly, community residents had a lot of concerns about the public health concerns, about the disruption in the community, but police force isn't the appropriate response to that. So, we want to make sure people get treatment for the issues that they're dealing with.
Well, I certainly agree with you. We need much, much better and much more data. Given the time, why don't we turn it over to the audience for questions. Well, thank you.
So we have two people who have their hands raised at this point. Elizabeth Dre, why don't you ask your question first?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm zooming in from Arlington. I'm wondering what you think about our local police chief is talking about using body cameras as a response to, well, let's just say that she's talking about using body cameras. And I've read mixed reviews about what anti-racist advocates think about body cameras. And so I'm wondering what you think about them.
Yeah, you know, again, it's a mixed bag. For as much as they can be a tool for greater police accountability, they have to be accompanied by strong privacy protection policies. When they have to be turned on, when they can't be turned on, how long is the data stored, for what purposes is it stored? And a key provision that oftentimes gets missed are what are the disciplinary measures included in the policy for officers' failure to abide by the use of the policy. Clearly, there must be prohibitions on any type of biometric surveillance capabilities, you know, real-time face recognition technology, anything like that. The tension, I think, is with it being just another tool of surveillance, because if officers are wearing body-worn cameras, they're capturing everything that people are doing in the immediate vicinity. And for communities that are oversaturated with police presence and over-criminalized already, it's a huge problem. So, you know, there are some advocates who are just like, you know, police are gonna beat us down and treat us wrong regardless if we've got video footage, right? You saw Eric Garner get choked out on camera. We saw Tamir Rice get shot. We saw George Floyd get choked out. So, like, what does the camera do? That said, there have been several cases where motions to suppress have been allowed because the officer's version of events did not match up with their own body-worn camera testimony. And conversely, there are claims against officers for misconduct where the body-worn camera footage doesn't line up with what the complainant said. So, you know, I'm mixed on it just because the oversaturation of surveillance in Black and brown communities, particularly, while recognizing the benefits. So if it is going to be introduced, there have to be very strong policies. And to the extent folks in Arlington want to do some advocacy around that, we have a page on the ACLU website that has a model policy, et cetera.
Thank you.
So we also have a question from Evan McKay.
Hello, thank you so much for sharing your time with us right now and for your work throughout the Commonwealth. I often read about the influence of statewide networks of elected prosecutors like the California District Attorneys Association, the Virginia Association of Commonwealth Attorneys, and I'm interested in the role of the Massachusetts DA Association in perhaps enabling or confronting statewide reform, and how you and your organization's capacity think about building collaboration and decarceral efforts or efforts towards police accountability across DA jurisdiction.
Yeah, so the Massachusetts District Attorney Association is the problem from my perspective. It is tantamount to the lobbying arm of the district attorneys. They are the entity that is consistently in opposition to decarceral reforms. And despite the fact that there are 4 progressive or progressive-leaning prosecutors in the association, there's 11 DAs in Massachusetts, so there are minorities there. So, you know, I think there needs to be more work to hold that agency or association accountable, and it's certainly something that we've contemplated, but I guess there's bandwidth issues around that. So we'll just continue kind of our grassroots work on direct prosecutor accountability, and to this idea of building strength across the state to have more decarceral policies or practices from district attorneys. You know, this 2022 election, we are going to be working in 8 counties. The 5 that were contested last time, Middlesex, Suffolk, Plymouth, Worcester, and Berkshire, but then 3 more, Hampden County, which is Springfield, Bristol County, and Essex County, which is up North Shore. So, and the approach that we've taken this time, which is different from the approach we took last time, is we had one singular coalition that was largely based in Boston, and we were doing the work from here without a lot of direct input from folks in community. And so this time we've started out by focusing on each of the counties and working with organizations that work with directly impacted, formerly incarcerated, system involved folks to build out a prosecutorial accountability agenda specific to that county. So if there is a contested election, or even if there isn't, when the election happens, there are a set of community-based issues and demands that are coming from folks in the community to really push that forward.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, you can ask a follow-up question and I'll move on.
Thank you so much. And so is your goal to gain a majority on this association, or are you pushing people to leave the organization entirely to challenge its credibility and its legitimacy? I know earlier you were speaking about abolition. And do you think that gaining a progressive majority on this statewide association of prosecutors
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that's the critical point, right? Do we make an investment in the effort to, right? Because if we're trying to dismantle these systems in the long run, you know, some would argue that this is a harm reduction approach, right? Get prosecutors in there who are less harmful, who will do less damage to community, and help support the narrative that the conversation around public safety is the wrong one, that we're having the wrong public safety conversation. And so, you know, but at the same time, we're not trying to build those folks up and put them on the pedestal to say this is the panacea, progressive prosecutors, because it's not. And I think similarly, by, you know, creating an alternate district attorney association with just 4 DAs isn't going to serve the purposes or principles of abolition or even generally criminal law reform, because it's another entity that is going to be taking up room. I think it's better if they're fighting internally to change that organization. And you know, and you know, the whole conversation around resources that goes to one, this association, but also the conversation. You know, and as district attorneys change, there could be a dramatic shift where there's only like one progressive prosecutor left, and what happens to that association. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
So we do have a question from Rebecca Gruber, but since Evan just asked you a question about abolition, I kind of wanted to jump in there and be a little provocative, or maybe it's not provocative to you. So why shouldn't we consider seriously abolishing the use of police in communities of color, especially low-income communities of color? Because I'm thinking about 3 points. And the first is that you can make a real good argument that they actually create more harm than good. They do a lot of damage in terms of police brutality. A lot of the aggressive policing practices that they use, even if in the short term, they might have some positive benefits. We're increasingly seeing a good body of evidence to suggest that there are these major social harms, social costs that are associated with them, not just to the individuals who have been, who have encounters with them, but to the broader community. For instance, there's one scholar here who shows that when someone is killed by the police within, a neighborhood where you live, that student, a child, is less likely to go to school. Their grades drop, and that's over multiple semesters. They're less likely to graduate from high school, and they're much less likely to go on to college. That is the one study to indicate this kind of harm. So we could think about these harms that are associated with this idea that they over police and under police at the same time. The second is that, this is a point that you mentioned, it's not like they do really well at solving crime. Just don't, the rate at solving murders, for instance, is abysmal and, seriously connected to the distrust, but the distrust that I would say they deserve, that is deserved given the nature of these relationships over time. So there's not that function. And then the third is that increasingly we're seeing more options around how to address crime and disorder in some communities that suffer from it. And one point you made, we need to invest in these communities far more than we do, and that probably would go a long way. But there are other programs and ways of approaching issues that seem to be far more effective. So for instance, Cahoots deals with issues not just of mental health, but other concerns, conflict, etc. Of the 27,000 calls, if I'm remembering correctly, it might be 25,000 calls that went out for mental health issues, conflicts that emerge, including, I think, domestic disturbances. It expanded beyond, it went well beyond that. They only needed to bring in the police 250 times of those 25,000 times they were called, which suggests the police aren't actually needed for a whole host of situations that we think that they should be called in for. And we do have other studies that suggest if you were to disaggregate the functions that they engage in, very little of it seems to be related to crime at all, including in high crime neighborhoods. So can't we make an argument for removing police by and large from these communities and providing other kinds of services that might better serve a community that for generations have been beset by the problems associated with these relationships? I'm having a hard time, again, being provocative, seeing a path forward that gets us to a better place, given generations of having this conversation and not really getting anywhere. Just throwing it out.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think you made the argument for why we need to pursue an abolitionist agenda when it comes to policing. But the thing that we have to overcome are these ideals around what role police play in society, and because that has not been disentangled from our ideas around race and the function of white supremacy in our country, people still see police as valuable. And this is a lot of people, Black people, white people, Latinx folks, indigenous folks, they understand that there are threats to their safety and that there is a need to redress harm. The problem is the police are presented as the only solution to those things. And until there is a space that is created that, one, talks about the racist nature and history of policing and how it is used to maintain social order and structures of oppression in our country, and what the potential alternatives can be and look like, it's going to be hard to get there. And, and I mean, and to a certain degree, abolition exists in certain communities. You look at wealthy communities and they are not policed at the same rates that poor Black and brown communities are policed. And to the extent that policing is happening, it's the policing of other people, right? It's rarely of the residents of that community. It's about control and social order, right? Who belongs here? Who doesn't belong here? Who gets pulled over for looking out of place? Who gets the police called on them for looking out of place? Are there calls to respond to instances of domestic violence and sexual assault? Yes, and there's a role for that. There's a role for an agency, but to have like a paramilitary paramilitary force patrolling a community ad nauseum is just not effective. But the public narrative around that just hasn't shifted enough. It's starting to. The fact that we're having conversations about defund the police and that they're being taken seriously in some sectors says a lot. So I think we need to continue to have this conversation.
So absolutely, thank you for that. What comes next for you? What are you doing now? We know about the campaign to.
Oh, I was like, oh, I'm about to go eat dinner.
Yeah. No. Well, you can do that too, but before you do that, you know what comes now for you and the work that you do through the ACLU. There, you've done a lot over the last 10 years, I guess. I mean, I'm sure you did lots before that, but with regards to moving the agenda forward, helping to change narratives, educating folks, what's next on your agenda?
Some of it is more of the same, but some of it is, expansion. In my mind, it's really about building power. And like I said, we're continuing with the DA campaign. I think the more conversations that we're having in a broader array of communities throughout the Commonwealth, that window of discourse continues to shift more towards progressive values and more towards abolitionist ideals and philosophies. And so, the ACLU is not an abolitionist organization, but we have aligned ourselves with the movement for Black Lives and this divest and reinvest framework is something that we've adopted. We're also looking at systemic equality. How can we, as this organization, put pressure on governmental agencies and institutions to redress the harms and legacy of slavery and racism in this country? And so nationally, what that looks like is issues of around voting rights, around internet access, broadband access, around student loan forgiveness, but also specifically the collection of student debt, which is disproportionately more aggressive in communities of color, and also municipal equity in procurements and contracts. A recent report came out from the city of Boston that of all of the millions of dollars that they spent on government contracts, only 1.2% went to Black and Latinx owned businesses. And of that, 0.4% went to Black businesses in a city that is 24% Black and majority minority. Like that's unconscionable. Like there's no reason for that. And so, working with organizations to demand greater transparency on municipal contracts and institute initiatives at the municipal level, different ordinances to require that they handle business contracts and procurements a certain way, building power in the electoral space. Last year was the decennial census. So this year means redistricting. So there have been significant population shifts. I live in Brockton, which is the Blackest city in Massachusetts. And but for the 3 state reps and 1 state senator that we have, ain't none of them Black. Like, how can you have the Blackest city in Massachusetts and have nobody who looks like anybody who lives here? So, redistricting becomes a huge issue. When I was involved in redistricting 10 years ago, we were part of the Drawing Democracy Coalition, and our advocacy led the Legislative Redistricting Commission to increase the majority minority state legislative districts by nearly 100%. They went from 10 state rep districts, 10 majority minority state rep districts to 20, and 2 state Senate majority districts up to 3. So we're looking to do the same thing, because when communities are able to elect candidates of their choice, there's greater power there. We're also looking at municipal policing initiatives, just like we were able to shift the conversation at the state level on face surveillance through getting a bunch of municipal face surveillance bans in Boston and Somerville and Brookline and Northampton and Springfield. We need to do the same thing on racial profiling. Police departments should be required to collect and report all their data on all of the stops and make it publicly accessible. There needs to be more transparency in police budgets. You know, we've seen the success of advocacy and advocates in Boston who raised concerns about police budgets. So we want to have those same conversations and partner with organizations in different cities across the Commonwealth to hold their local police department accountable. Because one of the things that we as the ACLU and I personally have recognized is absent the base building in community and power within the community, you can introduce all of the ordinances and policies and laws you want, but if the lawmakers or the elected officials are not accountable to the people who have demonstrated their strength and an ability to address these issues, it's not going to matter. And so that's the work that we're trying to do and engage in.
Well, I look forward to seeing this unfold. If I can do anything to aid in that process, I am happy to do so. Also, I would love it if we could be friends. I've so enjoyed this conversation.
Yes, definitely.
Don't want it to stop. Rahsaan Hall, it's been such a pleasure to have you join us today. And we do want to keep in touch with you throughout, in the future. I appreciate all the work that you've done. And I would love to have you participate in a number of the events that we're going to be having here at the PCJ. Thank you so much. And for the rest of folks, we'll meet again next week where we'll be visited by a couple of key players at Roca Incorporated, a Boston, a product of Boston. I welcome you all to join us for that and to continue this conversation about how we might reimagine community safety. And again, would love to thank Rahsaan Hall for coming and sharing with us his incredible vision and for sharing with us also what you have done to help bring it about, to help to realize it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.